Welcome to the Security Economics Podcast. We have a great episode this week. First, Trump tariff plans are back with announcements of reciprocal tariffs, new 10% tariffs on China coming March 4, and new tariffs on America's metal imports. We might also see an end to the current trade war ceasefire with Canada and Mexico and see the great North American trade war really kick off next week as well. Joining me to discuss these developments and to try to make sense of what Trump's strategy here actually is Brad Setzer at the Council on Foreign Relations. Then, after we talk tariffs, we're shifting gears to talk about boats, because who doesn't love a good boat? But here at the podcast, I don't mean fishing boats or oligarch yachts, but America's nascent efforts to rebuild our shipping and shipbuilding industries. I'll be joined by William Henagan, a policy advisor at the Wilson Center and former White House official who worked on U.S. shipbuilding policy. Brad Setzer, welcome back to the podcast.
You're just having me on all the time. We can't keep from talking tariffs.
It does seem, Brad, that there's no way we can keep from talking tariffs, particularly in light of what we have seen over the last week or two, where we've had Trump propose reciprocal tariffs and get his team working on developing reciprocal tariffs. We've seen the announcements around steel and aluminum tariffs, which are coming into force in less than 2 weeks. And then just yesterday, Trump has renewed his threat for the great North American trade war to start that with 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And in between there, we saw some potential tariffs on copper with the new 232. And we see tariffs or docking fees or something on Chinese ships coming into the United States. So yeah,
and we're still talking about the possibility of 232s on chips, on autos, and on pharma.
It's just tariffs on top of tariffs on top of more tariffs, Brad. But that actually brings me to the first question I wanted to ask you today, which is, we've certainly seen a lot of tariff announcements. Do you think we are beginning to see a kind of Trump strategy around tariffs? And if so, what do you think that is?
I cannot make heads or tails of what the long run strategy is. On one hand, the enacted tariffs have been the 10% tariff on China next week, the tightening of steel and aluminum. That would fit within a approach which would suggest an expansion of the first terms approach. Sectoral tariffs where there's a U.S. industry that's on the other side that wants protection. Stronger tariffs against China designed to limit long-term trade with China. On the other hand, we have rather massive tariff threats against North America, a massive reciprocal tariff and discussion about how EU is designed to screw the US. And we have had no discussion about trade with Southeast Asia, trade with Korea, trade with Japan. Now, I would think that if you did a full reciprocal tariff, you would end up with significant tariffs on Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan as well. If I had to guess, based on the signals that have been provided, the reciprocal tariff framework, if you think of that as the baseline tariff that the administration is looking to impose across almost all U.S. trading partners, the likely baseline tariff from a reciprocal tariff that treats the value-added tax as a trade barrier would probably be well above 10%, so above the 10% across-the-board tariff proposed in the campaign. I think my gut is that they're heading towards a pretty high baseline tariff. It won't be completely uniform across all trading partners. And then we're going to layer tariffs on tariffs. So in some specific products, additional tariffs. That's the gut, but I'm not sure.
This reciprocal tariff proposal is kind of interesting because, as you say, Brad, it is not just we'll look at what they tariff us and then respond with that. Is we will look at what they tariff us. We will then add in a calculation of that. And they've given themselves a discretionary kind of X factor on top of that, where they're saying we will calculate, and they're taking industry views on this and stakeholder views on this. We'll calculate some value of the non-tariff barriers U.S. companies face abroad. I do take your point very much, Brad. It looks to be that their goal with this reciprocal tariff is actually a quite significant value of tariff that would be applied on imports. On the other hand, there is this idea of reciprocity as a long-standing idea in trade agreements. And so I do wonder if a high proposed reciprocal tariff will then be the basis for some serious negotiations, or we'll actually see implementation. I'd welcome your kind of thoughts on that and whether you think we'll see reciprocal tariffs start high and come down, or whether we're simply going to see very high tariffs going forward.
You've got signals that could go a lot of different directions. I mean, the Starmer press conference yesterday suggested that we might not need reciprocal tariffs with the UK. We could do some special deals with those select trading partners that Trump likes, where we have more balanced bilateral trade. So I think that would be the basis for thinking that the reciprocal tariff is a negotiating tool, not a revenue raising tool. And that if other countries are willing to come forward with generous offers, you can find a way out of the big reciprocal tariff. Whether the way out is down to 0 or whether the way out is you end up at 10, I think we'll have to see a few deals. If you are seriously going to put tariffs that are equal to the value-added taxes that other countries impose, because you falsely think that a value-added tax or a national sales tax is a impediment to U.S. exports to those countries, and it should be reciprocal, not to the actual tariff, but to the VAT, you're going to end up with high tariffs. VATs are one of those things you can't negotiate away. They are central to your revenue base. And if you're in Europe and you're going to need to spend more on defense, and you do need to spend more on defense, and you needed to spend more on defense before Trump, and with the possibility that Trump may pull back U.S. troops in a really big way, the possibility that Russia may feel emboldened, you're going to really need to spend more on defense. And there's just no plausible way Europe can negotiate away its VAT. So I am leaning now towards an expectation that we'll end up with pretty significant tariffs. Whether that is 10 or whether that is 20, I think is still to be determined. But the notion that we're going to end up at 0, that feels off to me now.
That's about where my expectation is as well. Even if we see deals are not going to result in kind of current U.S. baseline tariffs being maintained. It's going to mean a lower increase than we might otherwise see.
I mean, the model there is actually China, right? What was negotiated was a sort of stop on a process where you were rolling out 25% tariffs on an ever increasing share of the trade, but you didn't end up going back to 0. And so I think that is kind of consistent with the likely set of outcomes here.
Well, you bring up China. One of the other announcements we had yesterday was an additional 10% on China. I'll have to be honest, that was a little out of the blue for me. I have been assuming we would see threats of future tariff increases on China, but I wasn't expecting one yesterday. My take on that, in some sense, is Trump must think that he has not gotten the response he wanted out of the Chinese to his first 10% tariff. They don't seem to be flying over here to meet with him the way other foreign leaders faced with tariffs are doing. And he kind of thinks if he doubles down, maybe he will start getting the action out of Beijing that he's looking for. But interested in your views on what you make of this additional 10% tariff, which I have to say, based on experience, strikes me as something that might actually come into force next week.
Yeah, because I don't think the Chinese are going to negotiate this weekend. That's kind of not how China rolls. What was sort of been put out in the press is the idea that, indeed, as you said, that President Trump had expected President Xi to present him with a plan to cut off fentanyl exports, and he hasn't yet seen that. And so this is punitive for failing to do what was expected to make a better offer, specifically around fentanyl. Now, if you really think that's the case, then you are setting yourselves up for some sort of summit, some sort of deal, whereby in return for a real tightening on fentanyl production out of China and something credible, probably there's a trip and 20% tariffs can be rolled back. We probably all said have a little less trade than we did before the Trump 301 tariffs. But the increase in the tariff rate, once you sort of work through the difference between 25, 7.5, 0, the average increase was about 15 percentage points. So 10 plus 10 is 20. So it's technically as big or bigger a tariff than was levied in all of Trump's first term. And it's kind of come in place as in offhand comments on the side of this massive threat for the great North American trade war. But on its own, hey, it's It's a 20% tariff on iPhones, iPads, and laptops and games. So, not small, actually.
Yeah, maybe I should make it to Best Buy this weekend.
I think we're doing Best Buy. I'm doing a wine run. You looked at the January trade data, and everybody is front running the tariffs. We're going to have a blowout first quarter for imports.
I want to come back to Europe, Brad, and ask you about a point that I think you made very eloquent in some recent online posts, which is that as a result of some of Trump's Term 1 tax laws, we actually saw a substantial amount of offshoring of pharmaceutical production by U.S. Pharmaceutical firms who are now re-importing pharmaceuticals into the United States, manufacturing them abroad, and are now going to face a very complicated landscape where they get tax advantages for manufacturing abroad, but potentially outweighed by tariff costs when they ship the drugs back to the U.S. I'm interested if you could tell us a bit about how we got to this situation and how, if you were working at a pharmaceutical company, you'd be weighing the pros and cons going forward.
Well, one thing we can be very sure of is that no pharmaceutical company is going to hire me, given the somewhat nasty things I've said about their tax avoidance schemes. Look, how did we get here? We got here because we've had for a long time a tax code that encourages in various ways companies to produce offshore. Before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you could defer. Now, that's not avoid, defer. So you had to keep the cash abroad. It caused some complexities. Paying U.S. income tax on your foreign profits until you technically brought the money back. Now, pharmaceutical companies had to bring some money back. So Senator Wyden's report shows that on average, they were paying like 15 to 20% effective tax rates, even with most of their profits being booked in the first instance offshore. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump tax cuts, was a radical reform to the structure of the U.S. corporate income tax. It got rid of deferral. We have current taxation. So deferral, holding your money offshore to avoid U.S. tax, gone. What it did set up were multiple different tax rates. There's the 21% headline tax for onshore profits. There's a 13.125, it goes up a bit if nothing changes, tax on foreign derived intangible income, essentially exporting your intellectual property if you keep your intellectual property in the US. And then a 10.5% minimum rate on intangible global profits. Intangible, so on intellectual property. Now, pharmaceuticals, the bulk of the profit is on the intellectual property, it's on the patent, it's on the drug, so forth and so on. What pharmaceutical companies almost all did, was to take advantage of the 10.5% rate. They wanted to pay 10.5, not 20, fair enough. And in order to pay 10.5, you need to have your intellectual property offshore. And because you have something called Subpart F, which makes it hard to have your intellectual property offshore if you're producing onshore and selling onshore, you actually needed to move the production offshore. So what you clearly see is a doubling of U.S. pharmaceutical imports in the years after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And what you're seeing right now is this enormous, rapid run-up in pharmaceutical imports from Ireland in particular, likely tied to Eli Lilly producing its weight loss drugs in Ireland. But firm after firm after firm has announced production of their new patent-protected medicines in Ireland, and we've seen enormous growth in pharmaceutical imports. So American pharmaceutical companies, and this sounds extreme, sounds like I'm kind of wild-eyed radical, and maybe I am. But if you sum up the reported U.S. profits of the top 6 pharmaceutical companies, you will find that they lose money in the United States. All of their profit. Guess what?
Drugs are so cheap here, Brad. It's like
I know, it's amazing. It's amazing. It's amazing. No pharmaceutical company can make a profit here because we hurt them so badly with our horrible pricing structures. No, they make all their money where the prices are even lower. All their profit is abroad, where there's much tighter negotiations and lower drug prices. And guess what? Because the profit's abroad, because other countries have found ways to collect a little bit of tax on that, they're actually paying all their corporate income tax abroad. The top 6 companies in 23, and it will be true in 24 as well, will have collectively paid 0 in U.S. corporate income tax.
I mean, that's a bad remarkable statistic.
It is. No. Yeah, it's like It is shocking. What's more is all it takes to show it is to sum up their own annual disclosures. This is not complicated stuff.
You can get AI to do that for you, Brad. It got even easier.
I don't try. I could, but I'm not very good with AI. Like old-fashioned. Anyway, separate question. If you're hit by a 25% tariff, interesting. First option, you try to go to Medicare and Medicaid and say, oh, our prices have to go up. All right. You pass it on to your consumer, or you pass it on to the pharmaceutical benefits manager or whoever is doing setting the purchase price for large insurance plans.
Actually, Brad, that you raise a very interesting point that I had not thought through here, which is that for tariffs on pharmaceutical imports, one of the largest end payers of those tariffs is actually going to be the federal government.
The
Medicare,
largest, not one of, the largest end payer could be. Probably in order to get the Medicare price to be changed, you need to get the private pharmaceutical managers to change their price, the insurance to change their price. But conceivably, your best outcome if you're a pharmaceutical company is you pass it on to the consumer, to the insurance companies, and then ultimately to the taxpayer, Medicare, Medicaid. So that's kind of possibility one. Possibility two is that you basically suck it up. You think this isn't going to stay around that long. You're going to amp up all of your lobbying. You'll think this will be negotiated away. And you say, okay, I'm not going to unwind any of my tax structures for a temporary inconvenience. I can't raise prices because the prices have already been negotiated. My production costs are pretty low. My profit margins, gross margins are 80, 90%. So I can just eat the cost of the tariff, in which case the U.S. government will get a huge new revenue stream and there'll be no increase in consumer prices. That would be in some sense an ideal outcome. But it's unlikely to be a long-run equilibrium because you've effectively introduced a 25% tax rate for companies that were avoiding a 21% tax rate. It's a short-run equilibrium. It's not a long-run equilibrium. Then your other alternative is to set up production in the U.S. That maybe takes some time. But if you're in the U.S., the drug was developed in the U.S. and you're selling to the U.S., you're going to be paying the U.S. headline rate of 21. So you might make that decision. Or what you can do in the short run, which is a little bit easier, is you could just say, okay, we'll check a box. We'll return the intellectual property that's now offshore to our headquarters. We will now contract with our Irish production facility to manufacture the drug at its actual production price. Remember, this is all inside a firm, so it's an intra-firm transaction.
They're going to try and lower the declared value of the...
Then you lower the declared value.
Yeah.
And then what was previously coming in at $1,000 a pop is going to come in at $200 a pop. You pay the 25% tariff, and then your profit, which previously was offshore, is now onshore, and you'll have to pay 21% on it. So, but the immediate, what would I do if I was a pharmaceutical executive? I would be calling up all of my friends on the Hill, reminding them how much money I've been contributing and asking them to weigh in on this, and saying that this was supposed to be on foreigners. This was not supposed to be a tax on Americans. But the reality is that American pharmaceutical companies don't pay tax in the U.S., increasingly don't produce in the U.S., and they declare all their profit abroad, which is an outrage.
You've reminded me, Brad, yet again, that the winners from these kind of policies are always lawyers, consultants, tax advisors, and lobbyists. So you're seeing that at least.
Yes, Peter, you are well positioned.
Let me change direction though a little bit, but staying in a sense in Europe, but also thinking a little bit more broadly to the reactions we are seeing various American trade partners have to Trump's various tariff threats. And I think we should all begin by saying we have seen China retaliate for the tariffs that were imposed already. It was a frankly fairly modest retaliation, in my view, and proportional, sort of reciprocal retaliation. Certainly, we have seen the European Union and Mexico and Canada all make very clear that if U.S. tariffs actually come into force, they will retaliate. I think we will see some of that. But the other thing that's been interesting to see, going back a couple of months now, but just with some new news on it this week with the European Union saying that they are going to try to conclude a deal with India by the end of this year, we are beginning to see some of America's trade partners look to make deals amongst themselves. And I'm interested in whether you think this is going to be a valuable endeavor for them, whether they are going to be able to use this to mitigate some of the impacts of the US tariffs, or whether you think there are other responses that they should be thinking about as well.
Look, I think in general, you can generate a lot of political buzz with these trade deals with alternative trade partners. They get a lot of headlines. They create a sense that you're doing something. And I certainly don't think for most trading partners, it is a reasonable response to try to kind of expand trade with countries other than the United States. So if you're Europe, I would certainly think India makes sense. South America makes sense, frankly. Tighter trade relations with Canada, helping Canada build the pipeline to bypass the United States so that Canadian oil can hit the European market. I think all that would make a great deal of sense. The part that I actually don't think makes sense is opening up to China. Why? Because China ain't a good trading partner. China doesn't import. There has been zero increase in China's manufacturing imports over the last 6 years. Not quite zero. $15 billion a year, less than inflation. Over that period of time, China's manufacturing exports have gone up by 1.2 trillion. China is not going to buy your goods. You're not going to solve the problem created by the fact that you're going to selling less to the US by selling more to China. All you do by opening your markets up to China, in a sense, is make the shock worse, because in addition to exporting less to the United States, you're going to be importing more from China. So I think that's the one move you should not do. But for other trading partners who are not China, who actually do two-way trade, by all means do those deals. The difficulty, say, Canada faces is that the US is like 80% of Canada's exports. We're just going to pay more. It'll still go to the US. So it's going to depend product by product. But you could imagine a world 5 years or 10 years from now where Canadian oil flows to Europe or flows to the Pacific, and the Canadian auto industry is integrated with the European auto industry. It's not an efficient outcome, but you could imagine that would be the equilibrium outcome if there's a permanent 25% tariff between the US and Canada. And if I'm Europe, I might be interested in some of these kinds of deals. So I think some expansion of your network of trade agreements is a sensible response. I think there are limits. The limit for Canada is that the US is too big. The limit for Europe, frankly, is Europe's too big. India is still a small economy relative to the EU. Almost all economies other than the United States and China are small relative to the EU. And a lot of countries already have free trade agreements with the EU. So it's hard to make up for Xi, who doesn't want to import, who's actually causing a lot of problems for German industry, and Trump, if you're Europe, with just trade deals. Your best option is not the trade deals. Your best option is yourself. Europe is a big market. It's been a little bit of a slow growing market, a little bit of a depressed market, partially because of some European policies. So to me, the most powerful response from Europe is to strengthen Europe's internal market. A lot of the Draghi Commission suggestions go in the right direction, and to expand European demand growth, particularly in Germany, getting rid of the debt brake and building out German public infrastructure, improving your trains. Like, that can use a lot of steel. China shows that it uses a lot of steel. It can employ a lot of industrial workers building Siemens trains. Siemens makes really good high-speed trains. There's a range of infrastructure investments in Germany that have been deferred out of fiscal rectitude, and now's the time to do them. And obviously building up your inventory of military equipment and building up your surge capacity to produce drones and artillery shells and all the other things that Ukraine has shown may be needed in a war with a near peer like Russia. That seems to me to be essential. So I would put a lot more emphasis, if I'm Europe, on self-improvement, on building up your own market, on increasing your own demand, than on external trade deals. But trade diplomats like trade diplomating, and the press loves covering these. And so itsy peddling deals sometimes can get blown up as big, important global geostrategic moves away from the United States. And if I'm the commission, I would probably want some of the press to be about how Europe is finding alternatives to the US, not just how Europe is building up its own strength.
That's a fair point on the optics and politics of this for Europe. On the substance, I have been thinking over the last month or two, there is actually a scenario in which America's kind of get tough with Europe posture ends up being good for Europe. Europe kind of hits the figurative gym, starts doing more investments domestically, does in fact build up its defense industrial base, makes a bunch of the structural reforms that Draghi and others have been recommending. There's obviously also a scenario where Europe doesn't get any of that right, and we just see continued painful economic conditions in Europe. I will certainly hope for the best here for all of our European friends and allies. Last question for you, Brad. This is a sort of crystal ball gazing question. When you and I recorded a month ago, there were tariffs on Canada and Mexico coming into place in 4 days at that point. Then obviously there was a deal that was struck to defer those tariffs until the 4th, this coming Tuesday, 4th of March, this coming Tuesday. We are now back near the deadline. Trump's reiterating those tariffs are in fact coming. Would be interested in hearing your odds on, do we see tariffs on U.S. imports from Canada and Mexico imposed next week? So that's our question A. Question B, 3 months from now, are there going to be higher tariffs on U.S. imports from Canada and Mexico?
I'm going to do a full Larry Summers on your first question. I think there's a 1/3 probability of a deal over the weekend that avoids any tariffs on USMCA countries. I think there's a 1/3 probability that President Donald J. Trump, in his benevolence, decides to lower the tariffs to 10%, but nonetheless put them on as a gift, to America's consumers. And I think there's a 1/3 chance that's 25% on all trade except for 10% on oil, which has already been announced. If we go up to 25%, then I think there's a realistic possibility it gets negotiated down to 10, or it becomes a bridge to whatever the level that emerges out of the reciprocal tariff study suggests would be the right reciprocal tariff for Canada or Mexico. Conversely, if we somehow avoid the tariff next week, I would put close to 100% probability we'll end up with some form of tariffs by the fall. I think where we started, I think President Trump thinks that the baseline tariff for all trade with the United States shouldn't be 0, which does mean tearing up USMCA. And if you think that, it's just a question of how you get to this higher baseline tariff and where that baseline tariff ends up being. But I don't think he will settle for 0. And I actually think he's set in his mind. He really has convinced himself that Canada should volunteer to join our union. And if it doesn't volunteer to join the union, the price should be tariffs. I mean, I think sometimes you just have to take presidents literally. And that's what he's literally been saying for 2 months now.
Brad, that's very fair. I also remember during the first term, there was a press conference he gave where he had this poster that was done up in sort of Game of Thrones poster style, or it said tariffs are coming in that Game of Thrones font. It certainly feels like that is where we are, whether the tariffs are coming in 4 days or in 90 days. Brad, thank you very much for this. This has been a great discussion and really appreciate you coming back on the podcast. I want to thank Brad Setzer for that terrific discussion. We're now going to shift direction to talk ships and shipbuilding with William Henagan, a policy advisor at the Wilson Center and former White House official. Over the past few years, there's been growing concern in the U.S. national security community about the decline of U.S. shipping and shipbuilding, and there are some truly startling statistics. China's shipbuilding capacity, for example, is now more than 200 times U.S. capacity. Shipbuilding is also a priority for National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who has told his National Security Council to come up with plans to address the issue. William's going to help us unpack how we got here and what the U.S. is trying to do about it. I think you're going to like this one. William, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Peter. How are you?
It's great to have you on. To kick this discussion off, maybe you could walk us through why so many folks in the national security community seem to have been getting focused on shipbuilding over the last couple of years.
Yeah, sure. I think there's been a recognition under both administrations that the atrophy of American shipbuilding is a fundamental national security and economic security problem for the United States that if we fail to address will be determinative of whether or not we are successful in competition, either direct military competition or economic competition with the People's Republic of China. Let me break that down more specifically into sort of national security and the economic security bucket. American shipyards are like very poorly positioned to meet the U.S. Navy's 30-year plan to build about 290 to 340 ships by 2053. The Navy's shipbuilding budget has doubled since 2015 and increased every year thereafter. But a recent review that we did in the Biden administration found essentially every major vessel acquisition program is over budget or behind schedule. The contrast point, of course, is China's shipbuilding industry has about 232 times the capacity of American industry.
232. I just want to make sure we heard that correct.
232, yeah.
Okay. Not 23, not 2.3, 232 times
US
capacity.
It's a level of scale that's like built over the course of decades and sort of hard to wrap your mind around when you think about it in terms of multiples. But what does that like mean practically? It means if you get into a hot conflict and ships start to sink, the PRC is at an immense structural advantage because the control of the seas in that kind of conflict will be dictated by the rate of replacement for surface and subsurface combatant vessels. So that's how to think about why the national security folks care so much. But the other piece of this, which I think people are waking up to now, is if we think about this through the lens of where is competition going to play out in the near term, if not a hot conflict, it's going to be in the theater of economics and technology. Shipbuilding is, even though it's an old economy sector, it's not tech or software, it's capital intensive. It's critical nonetheless to our economic security. And probably most importantly is we need a healthy fleet of US flagged vessels, which aren't necessarily vessels that are built here, but vessels that operate under sort of US jurisdiction to guarantee that American goods can go to market and make us less vulnerable to economic coercion, whether it's trade action or the restriction of goods or the breakage of capital flow or the flow of goods in any form or function. So those are some of the reasons why everybody's worked up about it.
Let me ask you a little bit about how we got here, because I think for a lot of our audience, you think about shipbuilding, you think about naval ships, you think about commercial ships. You also maybe have some memory of when the run up to World War II and World War II, the U.S. became a leading shipbuilder at that point, right? You had Henry Kaiser came up with the Liberty ship and a very successful example of industrial policy. And then I think probably most people have a sense that during the Cold War, the U.S. was able, certainly on the naval front, to maintain a strong shipbuilding sector. But maybe I'm misremembering that history. Can you just walk us through about sort of how and when did we start to see a decline in U.S. shipbuilding?
I think the way to think about that story from sort of 1945 to present is in two distinct stories where the end state is interrelated. And that's how do we think about the story of commercial shipbuilding in the United States versus the story of military shipbuilding in the United States. So if we start with the sort of history of commercial shipbuilding, after the Second World War, there's thousands of US built and flagged vessels. We held a strong position in terms of global market share for the number of commercial vessels being built in the United States in the 1950s, 1960s, and up into the 1970s when we were still building about 5% by tonnage of the global sort of vessels being put onto the water that are ocean going in a given year. In the 1980s, I think the story of commercial shipbuilding in some respects is the story of the entire American economy, particularly in heavy industry. We deindustrialized. The price of steel went up, the price of labor went up. And most importantly, in the context of shipbuilding, we stopped direct subsidies for the production of vessels.
So we had actually previously directly subsidized vessel production, even on the commercial front.
Yes, that was sort of life support for the industry, which extended its ability to maintain global market share into the 70s and the 80s, even as the shipbuilding industrial base and the supporting industries begin to decline in the United States. And I think the way to think about ships too, which should be helpful here to the story, is like a ship is basically 50% labor cost, 50% material cost. And of the material cost, 50% is steel. So if you're operating in a developed country where your cost of labor and your cost of steel, 75% of the costs of the production of the vessel, are going up substantially by comparison to potential alternatives in, say, Korea and Japan, which are the sort of initial rising powers in this industry, and then ultimately in the PRC, we grow significantly less competitive, particularly for the production of lower value vessels that are moving, that are relatively simple to make, they're big and there's lots of steel involved, and they move commodities and goods around the world. And the price of that vessel is ultimately tied to freight rates. So as we become a services economy, we just get worse at making that type of product. The the military shipbuilding story is slightly different. And I think it's probably worth illustrating the differences between the two, which is we kept up high levels of production through the 1980s. Similar story to the commercial shipbuilding story, even though it gets more expensive, because the military shipbuilding story is part of the Cold War buildup. But then in the 1990s, we significantly reduce the amount of spending on military expenditures writ large, in particular, the acquisition of major vessel and weapons platforms. And there's this sort of famous meeting in 1993 called the Last Supper at the Pentagon, where at the time, the then Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin, and his deputy, I think, William Perry, who later succeeded Aspin in the job, sit down with all of the major defense primes and say, look, a bunch of you guys are going to go out of business. We're going to cut military spending. And what then happens as a result in the yards that are specialized in the production of military vessels is those yards and that capacity begins to atrophy. And when that atrophication then occurs over the 1990s and the 2000s, as we focus on GWAT, which doesn't necessarily require the types of heavy machinery and weapons platforms that is necessary in great power conflict, and we see a big atrophication in our submarine industrial base in particular, then we get to the present, where now the US is producing 0.2% of the commercial vessels that are necessary, ocean-going commercial vessels by tonnage, and our military shipbuilding is in a sort of state of disrepair and over budget and behind schedule. And we have this big legacy fleet of ships that were produced a long time ago, and it's now very difficult for us to restart either our commercial industry or our military shipbuilding industry, because all of the base workers and suppliers and capabilities that feed those two very similar businesses is now no longer present in the sort of structure and fabric of the US economy.
You mentioned in your earlier remarks that China is the dominant producer today, that in the 90s and 2000s, Korea and Japan began to build up their industries as the US industry declined. Could you talk a little bit about why those two countries became the early movers as they see this opportunity, and then how China more recently has begun to take control of the industry?
Sure. Yeah, I think that to go sort of macro historical context is probably a good way to think about it. There's a lot of historical literature that over the last 500 years, typically at any one point in history, there is two major shipbuilding powers.
Really?
Who are
So just
producing.
sort of throughout history, it's tended to be
Yeah,
a duopoly provider of shipbuilding.
Portuguese versus the English, the Dutch and the Spanish, because essentially you have an ascendant power who's increasing its market share. And then you have the legacy player that's decreasing its market share in terms of the production of vessels because of the scale required to produce a ship. In 1600, it's immense scale to produce a galleon versus in 1975, it requires immense scale to produce the first VLCCs. If we think about the story of shipbuilding, there was a series of major players after the Second World War who then begin to wane. You see the ascendance of the Japanese and their ability to produce steel at a lower cost, and also their willingness to produce with lower cost labor. As the Japanese economy begins to grow more developed and advanced in the 1990s, you see an ascendant Korean and Chinese shipbuilding story. The big behind the scenes thing that's happening is the governments of all three of these countries, and then sort of no one more aggressively than the PRC, are directly subsidizing the shipyards in order to basically make work programs and also establish themselves as the greater player. If you think about it in a very industrial policy, government driving global competitiveness play, the idea is the government puts up the major upfront capital to create a shipbuilding industry, which you use much like a venture capitalist to grab a market share. And then you dial back the subsidies once you have an existing industry, but you're the major dominant player, so you get to set prices. I think that's the story that you see in Japan and in Korea. They do lots and lots of subsidies, and they still have subsidies for the ships that are built in those countries. But the Chinese have taken it to another level, and they're now the unambiguous sort of dominant, near monopolistic position in the market. They produce 50% by tonnage of the commercial vessels being produced into the market every year. And in 2024, so last year, they booked 75% of new orders. And that's a combination that's driven by two sets of subsidies is the way to think about it. One is indirect. So the Chinese are subsidizing the production of steel. And then at every level of government, from Beijing down to the city or province, they're also providing direct balance sheet support to the shipyard itself.
Let me ask you a little bit about what the risks of Chinese dominance, or maybe the risks of Chinese dominance combined with the decline in U.S. industry are. I think for a lot of us from a national security background, it is sort of intuitively obvious to us that we need to have a shipbuilding capacity for defense related purposes, right? Get into war, we need to be able to build ships. I heard you say in some of your earlier remarks, William, that you see one of the risks being not just on shipbuilding, but that we don't have much of an American fleet. And that if we got into a conflict, we might just not have enough ships available to carry out our own trade with allies and partners. I'd be interested in understanding from you how you see the risks of the current situation.
Yeah, I think this is a good moment to broaden it from just a ship story. And I think people get overly focused on vessels and the ships that are actually like carrying goods between point A and point B
Well,
to
people
a sort
love
of
maps. Let's be very clear. People love maps with little boat images moving around on them. So I get that, but
well,
I do
good.
take
So
your point, William.
let me like paint a little like map and picture for you with pie charts. Let's like think a little bit about the entire maritime sector and the role of the PRC within it. If we think about like how a like good of any kind like moves from a factory to a consumer, and that factory could be in Vietnam, it could be in China, it could be in Europe. The product is packaged and put into a container. The container, 90% of them, that cargo container, are produced in the PRC. That container is then placed on a rail, which if we're in a developing country is probably subsidized or financed by the PRC's Belt and Road Initiative or some sort of state-owned corporation, and then moves into a port where what's called a ship-to-shore crane or a rubber tire gantry crane or one of the sort of pieces of heavy lift equipment in ports all around the world, to include our own ports, takes the container and puts it onto a ship. The crane itself, which you followed any of the Biden administration's work, 70% of the STS cranes, which are the big ones that move the containers onto the ships, are produced by a single Chinese company that's state-owned, ZPMC. So now essentially to get any good to market, we had to put it on a Chinese-made box, pick it up with a Chinese-made crane. And we're tracking it, by the way, with probably free Chinese logistics software called Logging. And we scanned it, but with a scanner that was probably provided to our government for free by the PRC government. And then before we've even gotten to the vessel itself, we've essentially been unable to move our product from where we produced it to oceanborne trade without using a PRC manufactured or controlled maritime or maritime adjacent asset. Then the piece of cargo is going on the ship, which is today not necessarily a ship made in China. It's 20% of the sort of current global merchant fleet is built in the PRC. They have 50% of the market share. Their replacement rate over time, the average average age of a ship in the merchant fleet today is about 21 years old. So by 2030 or so, we may be in a place where we can't move any good in the world without placing it on a PRC built or controlled asset in some way. And that, I think, is the important part of the story that we don't spend enough time focused on or talking about, because it's the type of control over the factors of production to move goods within the global economy that's akin probably only in terms of centrality to the way that the US dollar operates within the global financial system. And the type of regulatory regime that a nation state with the type of control over that international economic piping that the PRC has in the maritime sector could provide it with the type of leverage that we now have in terms of sanctions. I think that's the underappreciated story. Why did they pick shipbuilding, or why is shipbuilding important? It's because it's how goods move in a globalized marketplace.
That's a really interesting point, William. You're arguing that essentially China is in the process of developing a choke point on global maritime trade, which is the overwhelming majority of global trade. I mean, there's a little bit of air freight, but mostly global maritime
80%
trade,
or something, yeah.
via their control, not just of the shipbuilding, but via their control of port cranes, of containers, all the different kind of nodes in this chain, which could potentially give them a very serious kind of global choke point, akin to what we have developed with financial sanctions and I think more recently in some ways with respect to our control over the semiconductor ecosystem.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily started out as intentional, but I think they're certainly aware of the potential of their dominant position in these sectors today. In the same way that we didn't set out, after Bretton Woods to create a system that was going to ultimately birth the modern iterations of OFAC and the Treasury's sanctions team. I don't think that's exactly what folks were thinking about in the 1970s when they began to put the whole global architecture together. I think it's the same story for the PRC. I'm not sure how intentional it was, but I think it's the place that we're landing and opportunistic or clever adversaries engaged in a game of realpolitik are going to eventually figure out that this is a way to induce or coerce countries, companies, players in the market of any kind to adhere to the policy preferences of the PRC.
I just want to say, I actually think that there was more intentionality to building out US dollar dominance. We sometimes give our policymaking predecessors credit for, if I look back, things Nixon did to encourage the petrodollar and things the Federal Reserve did to encourage Eurodollar. I actually think there's a story of intentionality there, though I take your point. It is not fully intentional, and there was a lot of market forces to it. I was wondering if maybe you could walk us through what over the last few years the government had begun to do in order to address this challenge.
I think the best place to start in some respects is the foundation of Friday's announcement is based on a trade investigation started in the Biden administration. At the request of the steelworkers and 4 other labor unions last year, the U.S. Trade Representative initiated a Section 301 investigation, which is an investigative tool under U.S. trade law that allows USTR to sort of pursue retaliation against countries that impose unfair trade barriers against the United States. The purpose of that investigation was to determine whether the non-market policies and practices that we just talked about, perpetuated by the PRC in maritime sectors, harmed U.S. industry. We then, during the transition between the Biden and the Trump administration, found that harm had occurred and left the application of the remedy to the Trump administration. So we spent a ton of time in the Biden administration trying to think about what can we do to level the playing field. But the challenge is that imposing costs on PRC-based shipyards and state-owned enterprises like CPMC across like other vectors of the maritime field is very, 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 very difficult and requires, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of most of the folks in the Biden administration, coalitional work alongside America's allies and partners. I think that there's some other things that we did too that were sort of more on the affirmative side as opposed to the restrictive side of the toolkit, which is worth highlighting. So the shipbuilding problem, immensely difficult. And I think that perhaps one of the self-critiques I would make of the Biden administration, which is that as we were passing the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act and the entire Investing in America agenda, we didn't do a major supply side investment in American shipbuilding and shipbuilding competitiveness and shipyards. That's probably a miss on our part for not thinking a little bit harder and about the ways in which we could have done that. And so sort of in some respects to compensate on the back end, we started looking at, okay, where can we deliver wins and where could America be competitive? And I think the place that we landed was ships that are highly complex, that require high levels of IP and technology and complexity to build are probably the types of ships where America can be competitive building and exporting them. We're not going to be competitive competing with the PRC head to head on producing lower cost vessels where their prices are tied to freight rates. That's what the Japanese and the Koreans do. So like
we're not going to have the scale for that, or our cost structure is just going to be too high to make it sensibly subsidizable, if you will.
We certainly could, in the same way that anybody who said that we couldn't produce conductors at a cost competitive rate in the United States was probably right, unless you pass the CHIPS Act. We could pass the CHIPS Act equivalent for shipbuilding and focus that money on low cost vessel production. And you know what? I think we'd probably bend the cost curve. Right now, it's 2 to 4 times more expensive to build a commercial vessel in the United States versus in China or South Korea. I think if we subsidized to the nth degree or to the necessary degree shipyards in the United States, we probably bend that cost curve to something much more competitive and begin to compete on price. That said,
there's an interesting question when we talk about an allied country like Japan or Korea, in my mind, whether it's worth it to bend the cost curve that much, or whether we should focus on, as you say, some of the higher end things where the cost differential is not as high and support Japanese and Korean shipbuilding for bulk carriers.
I think that's the place that we landed in some respects in the Biden administration, which was where are the places that we should be focusing our efforts in a targeted way that are smart investments, that are smart uses of government affirmative and restrictive tools to make America more competitive. We have to build some amount of ships here in the United States for commercial and military purposes. The question is what kinds and where can we most cost effectively differentiate and produce like real market edge. And so I think that's where we landed on those like high value service vessels, like icebreakers, undersea cable repair and installers, undersea construction vessels, frankly, like military vessels that we're willing to export abroad and use our military procurement process as a production on-ramp to global exports. If you look at some of the sort of like multilateral efforts that came out of the administration, so think AUKUS on the submarine side of the House, ICE Pact with Finland and Canada on the icebreaker side of the House, both of those were efforts to scale and expand the productive capacity of the United States to produce a very specialized, very complex ship, and then export those vessels to markets around the world. That's a place where we thought we could compete without necessarily needing to pass a whole new sort of like multi-billion-dollar legislative package. But this is perhaps a place where the Trump administration could take this work a step further and make the big supply side investment that wasn't made under the Biden administration. I would suggest that, like chips, we should start with the high value, high complexity chips and then work down the value chain as opposed to going the reverse. But I think that's an open question for debate.
I want to talk some about what the Trump administration proposed to do on Friday. We had a document dump of international economic documents coming out of the Trump administration. We had an EO on investment issues. We had an EO about kind of sticking it to the Europeans over their tech regulation that came out. And then we had this USTR proposal, which took a couple of days for many of us to begin to focus on, even though just looking at economic impact, I think arguably this is the one that's going to have the biggest economic impact and is certainly
Agreed.
important to our national security. And as I read the proposal, it has a couple of key parts. So there is a fee of up to $1 million for Chinese operated ships that come into the US. If you're Costco shipping, you're going to have to pay a new $1 million fee to dock in the US. Then there is a fee of up to $1.5 million for non-Chinese operators who are docking Chinese-made ships, the US. I see the goal here is, trying to encourage non-Chinese operators to not buy Chinese ships, but instead to purchase ships from other countries. And there's a fee based for those sort of third country operators on the share of their order book that is with China. So another incentive to diversify away from China. And then there's this really interesting requirement that kicks in a basically de minimis way this year, but that scales up over time, that in addition to these fees for docking Chinese ships at U.S. ports, there is this export requirement that I think will probably be fairly hard to administer. So there's a requirement that over time, an increasing share of U.S. exports will have to be exported, carried on U.S. flagged, U.S. operated, and ultimately, starting in a couple of years, U.S. built ships. And that obviously is going to create a direct incentive to purchase U.S. ships as opposed to, for example, Japanese or Korean ships. I'm curious, you have thought about shipping policy issues and shipbuilding policy issues for a couple of years now, William. Do you think this is going to work?
I think that the first thing we should probably think through is, what do we think the objectives of the proposal are? If I was putting my NSC hat back on, what am I trying to do with this proposal? It seems to be they're trying to do two things. The first of which is that they're trying to impose costs on PRC shipyards by convincing ocean carriers to purchase their ships from non-Chinese sources. And I think that's a laudable objective and one that we tried to focus on in the Biden administration and had a really hard time figuring out a workable solution to. I think the second thing that it appears that the remedy is trying to do is also induce or require use of U.S. built vessels, which is, I think, an unusual action to include in a sort of remedy under a trade investigation. Because it's attempting to encourage companies and market players who aren't necessarily perpetuating the harm that the investigation found to take a set of actions to remedy the harm created by the PRC's non-market policies and practices. If I just think through the service fees more specifically, I think it's probably useful to go one by one on these. Is the service fee on Chinese maritime transit operators, as they're called in the paper, which is just like Costco and Chinese-based shipping companies, going to work? I think, yeah, it's probably going to disadvantage those shipping companies by comparison to non-Chinese companies, just because there's no way out of it for them. Their cost of business goes up. Their cost to ship goods from China to the United States or to ship on their vessels goes up. And it's functionally going to just be a tariff by a different name called a port fee. I think the more interesting question is the service fee on the ocean carriers with a percentage of their fleet, which has been built in the PRC, going to work. I think there's a few forms of risk here that I'll be interested to see how the Trump administration handles. And I think there's more potential for things to go awry. The way I would think about this risk is in two forms. It's implementation risk and compliance risk. So implementation wise, Customs and Border Protection is going to have to implement this. And I think the question I have is, does CBP, if they're the implementing arm, do they have the staff and resources necessary to essentially engage every shipping company that's docking at every US port, which is thousands of ships and probably hundreds of companies in a given year, to pre-assess what percent of the company's global fleet is Chinese built? I have a few questions about whether or not CBP will be able to do this effectively, quickly, and fairly with the current staffing levels. So we may have just created a need to comply with this or to implement this requirement to increase the funding for CBP, which means increasing the funding for DHS. The second basket of risks, which I think is probably more salient to whether or not this is going to work, is compliance risk. There is no large American shipping company. And there are Danish, Swiss, French, Chinese, Korean, Japanese firms who I think have relatively little incentive to provide US officials with the information they're requesting, or simply spin out of their businesses into other legal entities all of the ships in their fleet that are PRC built, and then run them on non-US routes and hold them in holding companies outside of the reach of US regulators. So that's, I think, a core risk. So I think those are two forms of risk. Now, I think the question of whether or not this is going to work, I think the places I would look now is like, what is MSC saying? What is Maersk saying? How are they responding in terms of their willingness to comply? Because I think it's ultimately going to come down to a decision that those individual company leadership teams are going to have to make in terms of how they react to this. Frankly, the Trump administration could substantially increase the likelihood of implementation success if they pulled on board some of America's allies and partners to replicate this regime. So it's going to be a question of, can you get the Europeans to help you implement this? Can you get the Koreans and the Japanese and others to help you implement? And I think that's a real outstanding question.
That's a very fair point, William. I mean, I've done a little bit of work over the years with the maritime industry, and I think it would be fair to characterize many aspects of the global maritime industry as opaque. And I can definitely imagine that there are probably already lawyers in London and in Athens and in Seoul,
Monaco,
looking at whether there are complex corporate form transactions that ship owners can engage in to get around the intent of these requirements. And I very much take your point, William. I think the Trump administration will be on much stronger footing, just very practically speaking, to implement this if they can get a couple of U.S. allies to come along with a scheme like this, or at the very least to help come along with getting their companies, what are fundamentally their companies, in order to implement or cooperate with us on implementation. I also want to ask you about implementation of the U.S. flagged, U.S. operated, ultimately some degree U.S. built export requirements. It does seem to me that the authority to implement a docking fee is probably within the bounds of the 301 statute. But the export requirement, probably something the lawyers will dig into, and I suspect will be challenged, though, again, I've not yet dug into that in detail. But I also see a real administrability challenge on that. It's going to be very hard in a regulatory sense to ensure that a certain percentage of U.S. exports are being carried on U.S. operated, U.S. flagged, and to some degree U.S. built ships. And I will be interested to see the administration try to develop a compliance regime here. I'm wondering if this is something you had thought about at all, or looked at at all, or had any views on.
I think it's possible, but it will require a substantial growth in a new regulatory apparatus at some existing agency. I think perhaps that there are some flexibilities that they could add in terms of creating de minimis standards, or adding different sort of carve-outs so that you focus the activity. But I'm not sure that it's possible without standing up a whole new sort of effort at some existing government agency like CBP that says, okay, we're going to have a new database with every shipping company in the world and every company or legal entity that is executing an export of a U.S. capital good, consumer good, agricultural product, petroleum, chemical, et cetera, and then ask for some kind of proof back that they exported some percentage on a U.S. built vessel.
You can't talk about shipping without talking about the Jones Act. I mean, in some ways, it feels to me like a little bit of a global Jones Act.
And I think what I would say there is, what is the objective of this sort of second half of the remedy here? The objective here is not to level the playing field with the PRC. It's to induce demand for U.S. built and U.S. flagged vessels, which is unusual for a trade remedy. And I think the question is then it's fundamentally just regulation. And so it's demand for a particular product produced in the United States, derivative from regulation. And that's ultimately exactly what the Jones Act is. It's a regulation about the movement of goods and services between coastwise points in the United States in an effort to induce demand, organic demand for US built vessels. And I think the legacy of the Jones Act in terms of actually inducing demand is challenging and not particularly viewed to be like an enormous success. My question is, in reality, what needs to happen is a major piece of legislation like the SHIPS Act needs to pass. And that includes both the supply side supports that feed the demand side inducements that then can feed some regulatory compliance and requirements. But just doing the demand induction from regulation may ultimately result in like further constraints and costs placed on, US exports.
Last question for you. What advice do you have for the Trump administration as they revise and then move towards implementing this proposal?
We need a supply side investment. So we need a chips for ships style investment. I think reconciliation presents a strong opportunity to do that. And then if we're serious about shipbuilding, we have to put our money where our mouth is. And this is a capital intensive industry that only government is going to put up the upfront capital to revitalize. So that's action number one. I also think in terms of the trade specific and trade focused restrictive levers here, to achieve the Trump administration's goals and impose cost on the shipyards and the PRC, I think that they're going to need to think about the cost benefit analysis of a multilateral trade effort that focuses on changing the purchasing incentives of major European, Japanese, and Korean ocean carriers that currently buy PRC built ships, and as well as the international terminal operators that buy PRC built port equipment, and then pull all of that together to erect trade barriers that are similar across countries and fence out the Chinese and funnel demand into US and allied shipyards and maritime production. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be straightforward because you're going to have to convince the Europeans to raise their own cost of doing business in particular. But I think that ultimately the Trump administration is going to have to decide whether or not essentially imposing costs on the Europeans is less valuable or more valuable than the Europeans imposing costs on the Chinese. And I think that is the fundamental national security decision that needs to be made. And I think to most observers, it's very clear what the appropriate path is and who America's adversaries are and aren't.
William, this has been a terrific discussion, and thanks very much for joining today.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of Security Economics. I'm your host, Peter Harrell. I really want to thank Brad and William for joining for two really interesting and thoughtful discussions. We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening.